Hi, I'm Leon Lovelace, and this is Unstoppable Force. Now, I need your help. I need you to go to my PayPal link and put a link in the description box below. I'm also throw it on the screen here to go there and donate so I can expand this channel. But I've had this new story on hold for quite a while, so I got distracted and wanted to talk about different news stories that popped up. One, but a few months ago, I talked to one of my friends, and she talked about how her husband, he's a chemist, and she said that he talked about how the Gen X contamination in Wilmington wasn't that big a deal because the amount of pollution that's in the water, however many parts per million or parts per billion, wasn't too high, so a lot of the population didn't really have to worry about that. But he did say that people do have to worry about hog waste that could be in the groundwater. So when I heard her talk about that, I said, "Oh, you know what? I'm actually gonna check that out and do a story or two about it." But I was still thinking that there's no way I'm just gonna disregard Gen X pollution because Gen X is a pretty serious chemical that could cause all sorts of health problems to people. So I thought that was interesting that um, her husband did say that. And then I also wanted to do this story about hog waste and hog farms in North Carolina is because I think maybe it was a month ago that Jamal Thomas, he was talking about, or he was doing a video about something, and then one of his viewers called in and he talked about how North Carolina there's these hog farms, and how the caller described it was saying that, man, these hog farmers, what they do is they have all these hog farms, or these hog farmers, they have like so many thousands of hogs, and there's so many, there's just so much poop that they have to try to dispose of that it's just difficult for them to dispose of it. So his viewer said what they do is they put in the sprayers and then just spray it all over the place, and it just gets spread everywhere all over the town, and the poop is just flung all over the buildings and all the houses, just all in the air, and you can people are just breathing it and stuff, and it just covers everything. And Jamal was just laughing, and just we're just both in disgust that just the fact that a company might be doing that because he's been doing news stories, and I'm sure his viewer that called in and was talking about that was watching other progressive media news show hosts doing all sorts of stories about the corruption and um, the corruption in our political system. So it sounded pretty feasible that that happened, but we were just so disgusted at how at the possibility of that happening. And I said, you know what, I really want to check that out. So I did do some research and I found some news articles that did support that. But I'm not going to talk about those right now because my coworker actually just talked about this earlier today. And this article is from the Raleigh News and Observer, but this was from last month. And I want to talk about some other news stories too, or news articles, but they're a little bit older, but they're still relevant today. All right, because a North Carolina jury has awarded more than $25 million to a couple in the eastern part of the state who filed a nuisance lawsuit against Smithfield Foods, the world's largest pork producer, for the swarms of flies, stench, rumbling trucks, and other downsides of the hog farm next door. Verdict came Friday after the jury deliberated. Um, Skip a little bit. It is the second verdict for hog farm neighbors in a series filed against Smithfield Foods. The decision also comes in a week in which North Carolina lawmakers adopted a new farm act that restricts when and how neighbors can bring such claims in court in the future. So this act also seems like these lawmakers are pro corporation. So be ready to get fucked over by some more hog farmers in the future, especially if you live in rural communities. Okay, I'm not going to go in detail about all of it because I want to talk about other things too, but they said they sued Smithfield Foods as part of a legal strategy that a team of lawyers began crafting in 2014. And the lawsuits were filed by 500 residents. So I'm not sure why it's only talk about only one couple won 25 million when it seems like they should be talking about, especially early in the article, that the 500 residents all won up to, or collectively won 25 million or something like that. Because it's against Murphy Brown / Smithfield Foods, are focused on the pork industry's giant's continued use of anaerobic lagoons in which hog waste is stored behind livestock pens, then liquefied and sprayed onto nearby fields. The lawyers went after the pork producers, contending that such a practice presents a public nuisance. So one thing I have a gripe about is that they just talk about public nuisance, and when you think about a public nuisance, it's something a lot less egregious and less detrimental to your health than hog waste just being sprayed across across fields, and then that spray can actually get picked up by the wind and just splatter on people in their houses and their other items that they have outdoors, which I'm sure now, at least for these people that live right next to these hog farms or close to them, they really don't have too much that's actually outside because of them having to worry about hog waste being sprayed on it. But I'm just a little surprised they're not talk about how it's a public safety issue, because then people have to worry about getting illnesses because hog waste is actually it's in the air a lot more than it should be, and physical waste, hog waste, is actually getting sprayed onto people's houses and the people and the property occasionally when the farmers actually start spraying the hog waste. The article does talk about how the judge didn't want to make sure the jury actually went to the sites and smelled all the hog waste, because that was another thing they really focused on, was the stench of the hog waste is actually so severe and so intense that it actually starts to deteriorate some of the quality of the neighborhood that is just right next to the hog farms. All right, then it also mentions right here that the jury in the first case to be heard before the U.S. District Judge was awarded 10 neighbors $51 million, but the judge reduced the award to nearly $3 million because of a state law that limits punitive damages in such cases. And this is another instance where the legislatures is working for the corporation and not for the people. Yeah, but I'm just not a big fan of how they're just talking about it's a nuisance. Because hog waste being sprayed all over a community is a lot more serious than just a nuisance. Like some young teenagers just creating a lot of noise and playing loud music or something. That's a public nuisance. Yeah, I do have this older article written back in 2014 from NC Policy Watch. They talk about some of the serious implications about this hog farmers, because they talk about how the state's lax regulation of hog waste disposal discriminates against communities of color. Because I think what a lot of these hog farmers have done was these big corporations bought a lot of land that's just close to a bunch of minority communities and not close to a bunch of white communities. So they're compromising the health and the well-being of black people a lot more regularly and a lot more willing towards black people versus doing this towards white people. because a little bit early in the article it does talk about environmental groups stepped in and filed complaints with the EPA about that. Because it's not just about public safety, but it's also about civil rights. Why is it that the federal government or even local governments are allowing minorities to get screwed over by corporations just because they're minorities? Governments actually have a legal obligation to protect people of color because they're more vulnerable to be getting fucked over by big corporations when it comes to things like health and safety. Because it also talks about how Earth Justice filed the complaint against North Carolina Department of Environment and Natural Resources, alleging discrimination under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The groups contend that DENR recently issued a new general operating permit for hog farms that fails to protect human health and the environment and allows those facilities to continue to pollute water and air with a disproportionate impact on low-income minorities who live by. So I'm just hoping that in the future more lawsuits will actually specifically mention that this is for public health and safety concerns and for civil rights concerns, because black people have just the same amount of rights and need to be able to live happy and healthy just as much as any white person does. And a lot of these corporations really don't operate that way. So the federal government and state governments are actually required to make sure that these corporations don't just go in and steamroll black and brown people. I also have an article too that talks about other issues, especially the moral issues with the hog farming. I don't want to talk about that too much right now, but it is pretty brutal how they do talk about how we just pretty much treat them like they're just pieces of furniture, and we just shove all the hogs in just really narrow cages so they really just get wrecked physically because they're not able to just walk around in a field and just be a natural animal. So that it's pretty disgusting how we do that to all of our livestock. But this article I wanted to talk more about, that this article talks about, well, I'll start right here. The article is known as the Boss Hog series, told how politicians involved in hog farming helped pave the way for $1 billion hog farming expansion where corporations are taking over the industry and elbowing out the small farmers. The politicians did so by influencing state agencies, introducing bills, helping to pass laws, and forming policies that provide weaker environmental regulations and zoning protection for corporate hog farming. Many legislators in North Carolina have a history of receiving money from the hog industry, and some are investors in hog farming. The expansion of big business hog farming in North Carolina was done in spite of complaints and concerns voiced by longtime residents, local leaders, and environmental groups. But key to the rapid expansion is the way self-serving politicians, along with contributors to political campaigns, make millions from the hog industry. And this article talks about how these hog farms really started expanding in the early 90s, since about the 90s. So we the people are really going to have to fight to really force our government to really crack down against these big business hog farms, because the state politicians haven't done much to really make sure that they're actually working with the communities and making the communities a nice place to live, because they're actually doing to the contrary. They're just making the communities that they're in just a lot worse and a lot more polluted than they should be.